Buenas tardes, buenas noches. Es un placer darles nuevamente la bienvenida a la cuarta conferencia magistral del ciclo La Humanidad Quebrada. Este ciclo está organizado por el Museo del Holocausto de Buenos Aires, tras cumplirse 80 años de la operación Barbarroja y el inicio del Holocausto. El encuentro de hoy se titula Resistencia judía en Francia, a cargo del doctor Olivier Biebiorca, quien nos honrará con su disertación. Estará moderada por la licenciada Diana Wang, hija de sobrevivientes de la Shoah y miembro de la comisión directiva del Museo del Holocausto de Buenos Aires. La rendición francesa ante la Alemania nazi en junio de 1940 implicó un golpe mortal para quienes esperaban una derrota del hitlerismo. La pesadilla para los judíos residentes en Francia recién comenzaba, tanto en el territorio ocupado por los nazis como en la llamada Francia de Vichy. La brutalidad nazi contra los judíos y las poblaciones de Europa Occidental fue diferente a la aplicada en Europa Oriental. Y echar luz sobre las reacciones judías en Francia permitirá presentar escenarios no tan conocidos sobre lo sucedido allí durante el Holocausto. En Francia es posible encontrar ejemplos tanto de colaboración como de resistencia al nazismo en la sociedad en general y también en lo militar. En ese contexto se enmarcan las reacciones judías, sus posibilidades y sus limitaciones. La postal de Hitler en París evidenció el triunfo, por suerte transitorio, del totalitarismo nazi en aquel país en el cual las banderas democráticas de libertad, igualdad y fraternidad que acompañaron el desarrollo de la modernidad habían nacido. Pero somos conscientes que el totalitarismo nazi también es hijo de la modernidad. Es por ello que siempre corremos el riesgo de encontrarnos en esa encrucijada histórica una y otra vez. Lo advirtió Primo Levi al decir, sucedió, y por consiguiente puede volver a suceder. Deberemos reforzar entonces las herramientas para nuestras sociedades y las nuevas generaciones que permitan distinguir sin lugar a dudas cuál es el camino que puede derivar en un totalitarismo y cuál es el camino de la democracia. Sin dudas, es uno de los objetivos en el quehacer de nuestro Museo del Holocausto aquí en Buenos Aires. Muchas gracias, doctor Olivier Biebiorca, por honrarnos con su generosa participación en la conferencia de hoy. En nombre de la dirección del museo que compartimos junto con Fabiana Mindlin, agradecemos al excelente equipo que diseñó y lleva adelante este ciclo. Bruno Garbari, Marcia Raz, Eliana Ambra, Jonathan Epstein, Brenda Fischer y Gabriel Merlo, y a todo el comprometido equipo del museo. Muchas gracias también a la gran intérprete de nuestro ciclo, Dana Ioffe. También agradecemos el acompañamiento del Auschwitz Institute y a su directora para América Latina, Eugenia Carbone. En vísperas del Día del Perdón, del Yom Kippur, y a unos días de haber pasado el Año Nuevo Judío, les deseamos a todos Shana Tova Umetuka y Gmar Hatimat Tova, que seamos inscriptos en el libro de la vida. Continuamos entonces con nuestra querida Diana Wang, a quien agradecemos por moderar la actividad de hoy. Diani, te escuchamos.
Hola, gracias Johnny, eso es un honor para mí que me hayan invitado a moderar esto. Voy a hablar un poco desde mi lugar de hija de sobrevivientes. El pueblo judío ha sido acusado durante décadas de no haberse resistido suficientemente al plan de exterminio nazi. La frase de que hemos ido como mansas ovejas al matadero, por suerte ha dejado de escucharse, como antes que se escuchaba mucho, pero algunos lo siguen creyendo. Esta acusación de mansedumbre es en realidad una acusación de cobardía y fue una de las razones del silencio de los sobrevivientes durante décadas. Silencio que se potenciaba porque algunos le sumaban otra acusación, aún más hiriente y dolorosa, la de haber sido cómplices. Las víctimas fueron acusadas de cobardes y los sobrevivientes acusados de colaboradores. Ambas acusaciones no son solo injustas, también son ofensivas y en la mayor cantidad de los casos, falsas. No es verdad que no nos hemos resistido. Si entendemos resistencia como resistencia armada, es cierto, no pudimos hacer mucho. No éramos un pueblo guerrero, no teníamos los recursos ni la experiencia. El contexto de tiranía y horror hacía muy difícil la planificación y la organización. Aún así, hubo levantamientos en guetos, en campos, hubo grupos de luchadores que se unieron a los partisanos soviéticos cuando los partisanos los dejaban entrar, o que actuaban independientemente. Pero las grandes resistencias judías fueron las no armadas. Se trata de la resistencia de subsistencia, la cultural, la religiosa, la protección de las familias, en especial de los hijos, que estuvo en el centro de la vida judía. Francia es un excelente ejemplo de ello porque hubo varias organizaciones que se ocuparon del rescate de niños, organizaciones judías y no judías. Francia tuvo la habilidad, como gobierno, como Estado, de instalar en el imaginario colectivo a la resistencia francesa como una reacción generalizada durante la ocupación nazi. Novelas, canciones, películas dejaron la idea de que el pueblo francés se levantó todo contra el invasor y defendió a sus judíos. Es una hermosa historia, pero no siempre se atiene a lo que pasó. Hubo muchas situaciones que señalan lo contrario: la complicidad, la colaboración y la codicia, con el sustento de un antisemitismo fuertemente arraigado en la sociedad francesa. Sin embargo, algunos franceses, no tantos como el mito de la heroica resistencia pretendió instalar, se resistieron. En su presentación, el doctor Biebiorca nos ilustrará sobre lo que estos franceses hicieron, sobre la persecución, el rescate y la resistencia, cuánto y cómo hicieron, cuáles fueron sus contextos y dificultades, los prejuicios que conspiraban en contra, la participación de la Iglesia y de algunas poblaciones civiles, y cómo fue la lucha del así llamado Ejército de las Sombras. Tenemos el privilegio hoy de contar con la exposición del doctor Olivier Biebiorca, historiador, investigador de la resistencia francesa durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Integra una familia de intelectuales y académicos prestigiosos. Es el más joven de sus 3 hermanos, el sociólogo Michel Biebiorca, la historiadora Annette Biebiorca y la psiquiatra Sylvie Biebiorca, los 4 hijos de sobrevivientes judíos de la Shoah. Sus abuelos paternos fueron arrestados en octubre de 1943, llevados desde Niza al campo de Bon-la-Rolande y luego a Drancy, desde donde fueron deportados a Auschwitz. Sus padres sobrevivieron refugiados, el padre en Suiza, la madre en Grenoble. Olivier es miembro del Institut Universitaire de France y profesor del Departamento de Ciencias Sociales en la École Normale Supérieure de Paris-Saint-Cloud. Sus varias obras publicadas están centradas en la resistencia durante la Segunda Guerra y abordó temas como la relación de la resistencia con el ejercicio del poder, con el gobierno de Vichy, los huérfanos de la República. En castellano hay traducidos Los mitos de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y la historia del desembarco en Normandía. En reconocimiento de su distinguida carrera y de su producción en historia, en 2014 fue distinguido con el premio Eugène Collas de la Académie Française. Con ustedes, tengo el placer de presentar al doctor Olivier Biebiorca.
Thank you so much for
Muchas gracias.
your kind words. So the French and the Jews I would like to say that it's a gigantic paradox, because the relationship between Jews and the French during World War II, this relationship has been very, very complex. On the one hand, in fact, Jews have obviously been persecuted during the war, both by the Nazi occupiers, of course, but also by the French state. As Robert Paxton and Michael Maris have brightly shown, the Vichy regime has led a policy of prosecution without any German pressure. In October 1940, and then in June 1941, two statutes were promulgated, and these two statutes enforced a policy of exclusion. Jews were banned from several professions, mainly the army, the administration, the media, schooling, and a quota limited their access to the university. In July 1942, a policy of so-called Aryanization led to a mere spoliation. About 10,000 enterprises were purely and simply confiscated. And in October 1940, a law had given prefects the right to put into camps foreigners who were mostly, but not only, Jews, who were, between quotes, useless to the French economy. In the same time, the French authorities, mainly the police and the gendarmerie, helped the Germans to deport the Jews to Poland. The French railroads also took their part. The French administration registered Jews. The French police and gendarmerie rounded them up. Jews were put in French camps, guarded by French gendarmes, as in Drancy or Pithiviers. And so, as I have told, the French national railways conveyed them to Auschwitz. Can we, however, put on the same footing the French and the German policy? I don't think so, because Vichy wanted first to exclude the Jews from the public sphere, whereas the Third Reich dreamt to kill them. In the same way, Vichy made a distinction, even slight, between French and foreign Jews. The first were supposed to be protected by the French authorities. The latter were not. In fact, the État français even refused in September 1942 the deportation of the French Jews requested by the Germans. On the whole, and that's a distinction which has to be made clear, Vichy is not responsible for the Holocaust, but it has been accomplice. It reserved its custody to French Jews and coldly sacrificed foreigners. And moreover, it used Jews as a means of bargaining to be put in the basket of collaboration. Without the French help, without the help of the French state, the Germans would have been unable to deport about 75,000 Jews. You had about 300,000 Jews who were living in France, and so we can consider it as a very, very heavy toll. But on the other hand, a majority of Jews escaped that tragic fate. So if you see the figure, more than 75% of them escaped to death. So this is a very high percentage, which is quite bewildering, because despite an hostile environment, the 3/4 of the French Jewry have been able to survive. So that is the strange paradox, which is precisely the topic of this lecture: how Jews have been able to survive. First answer must be given, and it's a very sad answer. The French resistance has quite played no part in this rescue. In fact, historians are keen to make a distinction between the outer resistance and the inner resistance. The outer resistance was led from London and then from Algiers by General de Gaulle, and was to a certain extent a military resistance with regular fights, soldiers in uniforms, and so on. And the inner resistance, which was mainly composed of movements or networks, was acting in France, in the metropolitan area. So this distinction is probably useful, but does not really matter for our topic, because neither the inner nor the outer resistance has been anxious to help the Jews. So it's quite strange, because resistors were fighting for freedom, resistors were fighting for human rights, resistors were fighting against fascism, against Nazism, but they have not been able to mobilize for the Jews. So I think that three main reasons can explain these strange abstentions. First of all, many resistors shared the anti-Semitic prejudice of many French. In fact, you know that anti-Semitism had a long story in France, which juxtaposed several bequests. There was a medieval Christian anti-Semitism, which accused the Jews to have killed Jesus Christ. And this medieval anti-Semitism was still vivid, especially among Christians and especially in conservative circles. You have another anti-Semitism, which was the 19th century anti-Semitism. This anti-Semitism was an anti-capitalist one, mainly shared by the left. According to them, for example, Proudhon, Jews were responsible for inhuman exploitation of the proletariats. And from that point of view, Rothschild was, of course, a very powerful symbol. And then, at the end of the 19th century, Darwinism fostered a racial outlook. As Jews were supposed to belong to another race, they were inassimilable, and so they had to be expelled from the French community. And this racial or racist anti-Semitism was shared both by the left and by the right, and this merging of these two trends has created what we call the revolutionary right, la droite révolutionnaire, which is a concept coined by Zev Sternel. So these strong prejudices have contributed to put the so-called Jewish question on the political agenda at the end of the 19th century, at first in Algeria with Edouard Drummond, and then, of course, in the metropole, as the Dreyfus affair clearly shows. The Dreyfus affair burst out in 1994. Then a revival occurred during the interwar period because France entered a very deep economic crisis. And so Jews were considered as responsible for unemployment. They stole the jobs of the French, and they were robbing the French wealth and so on. And this anti-Semitism particularly focused on the Polish immigration of the 20s. Immigration was considered as an asset in the 20s because the French demography was not very vivid. But in the 30s, with the economic crisis, this Polish immigration was seen and considered as a problem. And on another level, many liberal professions, such as lawyers or physicians, denounced the Jewish concurrence. Last but not least, some scandals burst out in the 30s, and one of the most famous involved a Jew, Alexander Stavisky, which fed, of course, anti-Semitism. But many resistors in France or in England, even in de Gaulle's circle, shared these ideas. In London, for example, de Gaulle's legal advisor, Pierre Tissier, wrote in a book published in 1942, I quote, "The Jews who have only recently acquired French nationality and were not assimilated should be subject to the same restrictive measures as the other recently naturalized and unassimilated French people." And in France, Henri Freinet, who was a very, very courageous resistor, he founded a famous movement, Combat, considered that there was, I quote, a Jewish problem. Jewish capitalism, he said, was particularly dangerous because particularly powerful, he asserted. So you have many quotations of this kind in the clandestine press. This, of course, can, of course, surprise, but to a certain extent, it is not surprising if you consider that resistance was the mirror of the French society. Many resistors obviously shared these widespread stereotypes. On another level, some French resistors wanted to avoid to defend the Jews just for opportunistic reasons, because they took for granted that all the French were anti-Semitic. So they thought that it was very, very dangerous to defend the Jews. Resistance, in fact, in France was very weak. So such a crusade would make it unpopular. Even the communists acted very, very cautiously. In August 1941, for example, the clandestine newspaper L'Humanité protested against the execution of Shmuel Tizerman and Henri Gautreau. But Tizerman's given name, Shmuel, was strangely changed in Simon, which of course sounded more French. In the same way, the BBC carefully avoided to defend the Jews. They feared to be accused to lead a Jews' war, and this accusation was precisely the cornerstone of Nazi propaganda. So the BBC obviously avoided to give their foe more ammunition than they had. Last but not least, resistors did not realize that a specific and mortal danger was threatening the French Jewry. This blindness was, of course, due to the mystery surrounding the final solution. We know that the Nazis were very anxious to hide their crime, and then they chose to use vague phrases such as final solution, special treatment, and this kind of stuff. But France was also shaped, we are in France, so France was also shaped by a specific political culture. The French Republic, since the French Revolution of 1789, has always recognized citizens and always ignored communities. And that was the famous Clermont-Tonnerre, that's the name of the member of the parliament who was at the origin of the law. He said, "We want to give everything to the Jews as a citizen, nothing as a community." So this culture, this Republican culture, was very important because each victim, each citizen was equal, and no distinction had to be made between a racial and a political deportee, between a resistor shot down and a Jew murdered. All were equal. So, of course, this outlook was obviously unsound because the Third Reich led a private war against the Jews. So the Jews were not treated as, for example, the resistors or other people who were prosecuted. But this idea that everybody was equal in France was very, very vivid. And even the Jews involved in the clandestine fight shared these views, because many Jews were fighting in occupied France or abroad. Some were even leaders, such as Jean-Pierre Lévy, who was leading the French movement Franc-Tireur, Daniel Mayer, who was leading the French clandestine Socialist Party, Pierre Villon, in fact, Ginsburger, it was his real name, head of the Communist National Front, or Raymond Braque, who was one of the leaders of Libération Sud. But no one considered that he had to help Jews specifically. A clandestine newspaper, La France Continue, summarized this view. In fact, they protested against racial persecution, but the newspaper immediately added, we have the same respect for all martyrs of German oppression, whoever they may be. We are firmly resolved to avenge all of them equally when the impending German debacle allows us to settle all accounts and on a grand scale. So this view is not totally fair, because some resistors vigorously protested against antisemitism. For example, the communists condemned both the quotas, which were enforced in the universities, and the spoliation targeting small enterprises. Some Christians were always very keen to protest against antisemitism, especially a movement and a clandestine newspaper entitled Témoignage chrétien, Christian Testimony, and Témoignage chrétien devoted his 6th and 7th issue to this burning issue. I quote, "In bearing witness against antisemitism and for truth and justice, we bear witness to Christ. No temporal authority can exempt us from that witness. No spiritual authority can reproach us," they wrote. But inside as outside France, resistors never considered the rescue of the Jews as an overriding priority for ideological, opportunistic, and cultural reasons. That means that rescue was to be made by other channels. For strange and mysterious reasons, historians seem to consider Jews as minor and important people. And this view forgets one crucial element: the Jews have often themselves taken their fate in hand. So the first helpers for the Jews were, of course, the Jews. At first, the Jewish organizations saw the problem in terms of assistance. Many Jews in 1940 were unemployed, many Jews in 1940 were poor, and so the first task was to help them by opening, for example, soup kitchens. So they did as soon as 1940. And in the same way, some organizations intervened in French concentration camps to help detainees, such as the Comité de Nîmes Committee, or the CIMAD. These camps were the camps where prefects were allowed to send people who were, as I said, useless to the French economy. So the first ground of help were these camps. But these organizations, especially from 1941 onwards, soon realized that a lethal danger threatened the Jews. So, from 1941, rescue began to prevail upon assistance. So, two main solutions were used. Some organizations, which were very often financed by American institutions, helped Jews to cross the Swiss or, more rarely, the Spanish borders. So about 6,500 people succeeded to escape between 19 and 1942. But for most of the Jews, the safest way or the simplest way was, of course, to hide. So to hide, the Jews first mobilized their own networks. They paid, for example, smugglers to cross the demarcation line between the free and the occupied zone, and this line was still in order until March 1943. And so the main idea for the Jews was to flee to the free zone, so from the northern zone to the free zone, and eventually, after November 1942, to the Italian zone of occupation, which was supposed to be safer. And in fact, the Italian zone was safe, quite safe, between November 1942 until September 1943, so before the German occupation of the Italian zone, but not because Italians were brava gente, but because Italians wanted to show that they were their masters, they were the masters in their own zone, and that the Germans had not to intervene in their zone. So many Jews, for example, lived in Megève, in the French Alps. Why? Because you had many hotels who could host them, and these hotels, because you had no tourists, were empty. For the same reason, some went to the French Riviera, which was also deserted by its wealthy tourists. Some Jews equally tried to place their children in friendly families, and so they use their professional or their friendly networks or their neighborhood. These strategies, as you may presume, heavily depended on their own material, cultural, or intellectual resources. Jews who were inserted in the French society had very often a good position, spoke a perfect French, had money, and so they were, of course, in a very much better situation than the Jews who just arrived from Poland, who did not speak French, who had no money, as the example of the FTP MOE clearly shows. So what is the FTP MOE? During the war, the French Communist Party has organized a movement which was a resistance movement. It was not a political party, it was a resistance movement, FTP, francs-tireurs et partisans. And inside you had many organizations, and one was devoted to immigrants, MOI, main-d'œuvre immigrée. So in 1941, the French Communist Party and the FTP decided to help Russia. Why? Because Russia was in desperate situation. And so the idea was to help Russia by assassinating German soldiers. But as you may presume, volunteers were scarce. So the French Communist Party mainly relied on young Jews, and they became the backbone of the FTP MOE, which was a clandestine military detachment. But these young Jews were supposed to kill Germans, had in fact no choice. They had no means of living. They were totally unable to obtain false identity papers because they had no relations. Their parents had often been deported, so they were really alone. So the French Communist Party, which was to a certain extent very, very cynical, could easily exert a strong pressure on them. So the party will give these misfits money and papers, but they will, in return, accept all missions, especially the most dangerous. To hide, therefore, was not so easy, even if it was, we have to stress this point, for obvious geographical reasons, easier in France than in Belgium or in the Netherlands. In France, countryside, mountains offered a shelter which lacked, in fact, in the Low Countries. But on the whole, to hide was quite difficult, as much as the Vichy administration, as you may suppose, was not helping Jews at least until 1942. In 1942, in fact, occurred a turning point. In May 1942, the Germans obliged the Jews to wear a yellow star on their clothes. And this measure, which was reserved to the northern zone, it was never enforced in the southern zone, in the free zone, this measure deeply shocked the French. One thing was to accept a legislation of exclusion, of course, but another was to see your neighbors, your friends, marked as cattle. And we know the reaction of the public opinion, because the prefects were supposed every month to make a report on public opinion. And all prefects in all French departments noticed that indignation immediately rose. In the same way, very great roundups occurred in the summer of 1942. And these roundups, which were very, very harsh, especially the Veldiv roundup, these roundups were very, very, very severely condemned. We have here, for example, a report from the French police head in Paris, and the police head of Paris wrote, although the French population is fairly anti-Semitic on the whole and in a general way, it judges these measures harshly, considering them inhumane. The reasons for that disapproval rest in great part on the rumors currently circulating that families would be dislocated and children under 10 handed over to public assistance. It is the separation of children from their parents that most affects the French masses and produces reactions that find expression in harsh criticism of the government and of the occupying authorities. That is a report made by the Parisian police head on the 17th of July, 1942. And this emotion, this public emotion, was expressed, relayed, and amplified by 4 prelates in the southern zone. In Toulouse, the old Archbishop, Monseigneur Saliège, so sent out a pastoral letter in August 1942, and this pastoral letter was very famous. Jews are men and women, he wrote. One cannot do just anything to them, to those men, those women, those fathers and mothers. They belong to humankind. They are our brothers, like so many other people. A Christian cannot forget that. And 3 other bishops followed the same way. So the Vichy regime was very, very embarrassed. They attempted, but in vain, to silence the bishops. It was a real danger because in France in 1942, the French church was very powerful. The voice of the church was heard. And so there was a risk, you see, to see public opinion rise against the Vichy regime. And on the other hand, these stances legitimated the assistance that civilians were able to offer the Jews. because they were justifying this assistance on theological and moral grounds. And in fact, civilians were more and more ready to help Jews to hide. We have in fact to mention that some institutions were deeply involved in this rescue. So was the Collège Sévenol. It was a Protestant high school located in the Massif Central, and the minister, André Trocmé, hosted hundreds of Jews, maybe 2,500, who were hidden in his college or in friendly families of the area. In the same way, many Catholic institutions helped Jews. At Cap de Nac, it's a town in southern France, the institution of Notre-Dame de Massip hid dozens of children in 1943, as in 1944. In fact, many Christians were really revolted by the fate reserved to the Jews, even if many Christians ignored the bleak reality of Auschwitz. We have, however, not to idealize these behaviors, because many Christians acted for noble motives, but others did not. Some tried, for example, to convert the Jewish children which were in their custody. But, and that is what is really fascinating, the rescue was more often assumed by individuals, or, if you prefer, Main Street French. They could play 4 different parts. They could at first be guardian angels by helping Jews for a brief or a long time to escape. A neighbor could warn a Jewish family that the police was waiting for them. A policeman could avoid to verify identity papers and so on. Others were hosting Jews, here again for a brief or long time, and others gave false identity papers. At last, smugglers could help crossing the demarcation line or the Swiss border. So you see, you have many types of help which could be encountered. Guardian angel, hosters, people giving false identity papers, smugglers. But all were not heroes. And here again, we don't have to idealize these kind of behaviors, because some gave help for money. Others could blackmail refugees. But in fact, many genuinely helped Jews to hide and to save their lives. So on the whole, Yad Vashem had recognized in France about 2,000 just among the nations, but many helpers have certainly not been identified. So this mobilization, and that's in fact a pity to say that, this mobilization has been efficient, but a little bit too late. About 42,000 Jews had been deported in 1942. There were 17,000 in 1943 and 16,000 in 1944. So what we can notice is that the number of Jews deported decreased. But in fact, in 1942, there was still a kind of surprise. The French population, the French church, a part of the French church was not mobilized. And so the mobilization intervened, yes, but to a certain extent too late. So from this point of view, and seen from Berlin, the deportation has been a failure, even if the toll taken on the French Jewry has been very, very heavy. But in fact, you cannot compare the situation in France with the situation, for example, in Belgium. which was much more terrible. And this failure, I am speaking, of course, from the German point of view, has been mainly due to the mobilization of the French. In fact, France has not been the sole country to protect their Jews. Remember, for example, that in the Netherlands, in February 1941, a huge strike broke out to protect the Dutch Jews and to protest against racial persecution. But it led to failure because of the German repression and because also rescue was much more difficult in the Netherlands than in France for geographical reasons. I have already evoked this point. And in France, and that's also maybe a huge difference with Poland and Russia, the Germans did not dare to enforce a too harsh repression because they feared a political unrest they could not afford in 1942 and a fortiori in 1944. So France is, to a certain extent, a good example of civil mobilization. Of course, we cannot compare the situation of France to the situation of Denmark, because, as you know, and this example is perfectly documented in Denmark, 95% of the Jewish Danes have been saved thanks to the cooperation between society, administration, and resistance organization. And what we can say is that such a cooperation lacked in Vichy France. The administration was not always cooperative, especially in 1942. The resistance, the organized resistance, was not fully involved in the salvation of the Jews. And so there was not, you see, this kind of links of interlinking, which was really remarkable in Denmark in 1943. Jews, however, were not minors, I have said, and they were eager to save their lives, but they were also eager to fight in the Shadow Army. But their commitment was certainly much more complicated than for others. So, as I have said, many Jews got involved in the resistance, and some even led powerful organizations. But we have to ask a question, which is a very difficult question. Was a Jewish identity useful or helpful to be involved in the resistance, or was it, on the contrary, a break? Was it, on the contrary, an obstacle? A very strange commitment, a very strange statement, is often defended. Since Jews had nothing to lose, their best interest was to commit themselves. At least their death would be useful. And I would like to say that this thesis is totally irrelevant, because, as we know, you have a kind of vital instinct. And so we have to notice that some people say Jews never apprised, Jews never, apprised in concentration camps, but you have the same situation in Russian camp of prisoners. The Russians never apprised, they never approached, And so they were young, they were soldiers, and you have no more resistance in a Russian prisoner camp than in a Jewish extermination camp. The other element we have to mention that the other element, that we have to mention is that it was safer for a Jew to hide rather than to join the Shadow Army. A very, very, very interesting study has been devoted to about 1,000 Jews who were living in Lens in northern France. 467 were deported. But the survivors survived because they succeeded to flee, especially to the free zone, and not because they joined a resistance organization. I mean that to be committed in a resistance organization was a way to increase the danger and not to minimize it. But we have also to consider that commitment was very difficult for the Jews for historical as cultural reasons. First, many Jews did not realize that Vichy was a foe rather than an ally. They sincerely thought, and we have many letters, many correspondence, many encounters between some Jews and Maréchal Pétain. Really, many Jews thought that Pétain was protecting them against the occupier. And so they preferred to obey his orders rather than to ignore them. Jacques Elbronner, who was chairing the Central Consistory, declared in March 1941, the only hope resides in the presence at the head of the state of Monsieur le Maréchal Pétain, with whom I have made many contacts and who gives me hope of reparations one day for the injustice imposed. And so this idea was really deeply rooted. France could not betray its Jews, her Jews. And this attitude, the idea that France was a country of human rights, that France was protecting her Jews, this attitude has very deep roots. First of all, many Jews were really anxious to respect the law. They respected the law because they had a great admiration for French, which had given them civil rights during the revolution. But they respected the law also because the law had generally protected them rather than persecuted them. So you see, it was very important. From an historical point of view, law had been protective for the Jews in France. And so the idea that suddenly law could be, on the contrary, prosecute them was a terrible change. And from an intellectual point of view, it was very difficult to admit. And many Jews respected the law also because they feared to give grip to anti-Semitic accusations. In 1941, for example, and I would give two examples, Pierre Mendès France, who was a politician, he belonged to the radical socialist party. He had been minister during the Popular Front. So he was in 1940 involved. He was a draftee, so he fought in 1940, but he decided as a member of parliament to join North Africa in 1940 to fight. But in the meanwhile, I mean, between his departure in June 1940 and the 22nd of June, the armistice had been signed and Philippe Pétain had seized power. So the Vichy government accused Pierre Mendès France of desertion. In 1940, Pierre Mendès France could have easily escaped in North Africa. It was quite easy to escape from his jail, but he refused to do so because he wanted to get rid of an offending accusation. As you may suppose, the trial was biased, Mendès was sentenced to jail, and after the trial, and only after, he decided to escape. But of course, he escaped in much more difficult conditions. But he had defended himself and shown for history that Jews had made their duty and that Jews were not cowards. As I have said before, the Vichy regime forbade Jews to teach. And you had a famous philosophy professor, Guastalla, and he devoted his last class to the trial of Socrates. So you know that's a famous part of Le Banquet of Platon. Socrates knew that he had been sentenced to death for very bad reasons. He was accused to corrupt the youth of Athens. But he agreed to drink the hemlock because, said Socrates, you have to obey the city's law, even if they are unfair. So you see, it was in 1941, Guastalla did not request his pupils to uprise, to resist. He never said, you have to resist, you have to protest of fascism. He said, you have to accept the law of the city. So you see, this cultural background was not very, very, very good, you see, for resistance. So many Jews joined the resistance, not because they were Jews, but despite they were. And from this point of view, of course, many Jews joined the communist resistance. But why Jews had chosen to become communist? Because it was a way to escape your Jewish identity and to substitute a given identity, to be a Jew, by a chosen identity, to be a communist. In the same way, many French Jews resisted because they thought that they were, above all, French and not Jews. So the Jewish identity during the resistance was seldom revendicated, was seldom claimed. And so we can also notice that many Jews have chosen French pseudonyms during their fight, during the war. And what is also very interesting, they very often kept this pseudonym after the war. And so you have many examples. For example, I have spoken of Pierre Villon, who was leading the National Front, the communist organization. His real name was Ginsberger. Raymond Samuel chose the pseudonym of Aubrac. Léo Hamon, who was a very famous Gaullist resistor, his real name was Goldenberg, and so on. So you see, I think that it was very, very difficult for a Jew to enter the resistance. And on the contrary, it was much more easy for a Christian Democrat, for opposite reasons, to enter the resistance. So I think that it's time to conclude. We have to mention that 75% of the French Jewry has been saved, despite the Vichyist persecution, despite the Nazi persecution, and despite the weak reaction of the French resistance. And from this point of view, this result, which is to a certain extent noticeable, even if it's not a perfect result, shows first the mobilization of the Jews themselves, and we often forget this dimension, which is very important, I think, but also the mobilization of the French civil society. This result, I told, was uneven. It could have been possible, probably, to do more, but how? One element which is very important is the publicization of the persecution. The Bishop commitment in the summer of 1942 clearly shows that Vichy, and to a certain extent the Germans, feared public opinion. But and that's the problem, the attitude of these four courageous prelates has not been so widespread. And what is very, very important to notice is that voices who tried to protect the Jews, to alert on their fate, these voices had been very, very scarce. For example, France is renowned for her great intellectuals. We intellectuals are not in short supply in my country, but these intellectuals kept silent. For example, Gide, Claudel. You can say that Claudel was too Catholic, that Claudel was too conservative, but Gide, if you consider the younger generation, Malraux, Sartre, no one made a public or a clandestine statement denouncing the anti-Semitic persecution. And such a mobilization, however, would have been efficient because it would have legitimated the protection of the Jews and complicated the task of the French administration. The Germans would have certainly not reacted against a passive resistance. Their idea was to preserve law and order. They did not want to have trouble in France because France was a very important asset on the economic ground. So they preferred to have no trouble in France rather than to have to cope with the French insubordination. So from their point of view, the so-called Jewish problem could have waited in France until German victory. And so to gain time was, in fact, very, very important during the war. In the same way, the French Jews have lost a precious time. When they realized that Vichy was a foe rather than an ally, it was too late. Jews had been registered, their identity card had been stamped, many were put in camps. In these conditions, it was much more difficult to hide than before. So these statements are, of course, valid, but we don't have to forget a crucial parameter. People could not realize what was happening. No one could believe in 1941, as in 1942, but even in 1943, that the Germans were coldly planning a mass slaughter as much as they proceed cautiously. To understand this bleak reality took time, but taking time for understanding was a luxury the Jews could not afford, as time was running especially fast for them. Men make history, but they do not understand the history they make, as once declared Raymond Aron, the famous French intellectual. This sentence is very sound. Unfortunately, Jews have not been immediately realized that their life was at stake, and this awareness took time. It has been paid at a very high toll. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, doctor Biebiorca, lleno de informaciones que nos dejan pensando. No conocemos muy bien la realidad de lo sucedido en Francia, así que nos dio datos y cosas que desconocíamos y que revelan la complejidad de esta situación que no se puede reducir nunca a blancos y negros. Tengo varias preguntas, pero el tiempo corre, no puedo hacerlas todas, así que pido disculpas a los que han hecho preguntas tan interesantes y voy a juntar de a dos. Hay una pregunta que se hace saliendo de la conducta de los ciudadanos, en tanto ciudadanos, se pregunta por las instituciones. Junto dos preguntas. Hay una pregunta que plantea ver cuál es su opinión acerca del papel de la OSE, de la Vitzo, de todas estas organizaciones judías que fueron las que permitieron el salvataje de tantos niños. de la mayoría de los niños. Y al mismo tiempo, paralelamente, ¿qué pasó con la Iglesia en tanto institución? En tanto, así como usted dijo, estos prelados que hicieron declaraciones que no se difundieron, no se conocieron. Y bueno, esto, ¿qué piensa de las dos cosas?
Two areas.
So I would say that some Jewish organizations have tried to first help the Jews in the very difficult situation of 1940, 1941, and then to rescue them. The main problem was how to proceed. Did the Jewish organizations had to cooperate with the Vichy regime and even to a certain extent with the Germans, or had they to refuse cooperation? And we find, as always, the same problem with the Jewish Council in the East, which is it was in fact a trap, but what is better to avoid this trap, or was it better to try to cooperate to save some lives, even if they were not very important? And from this point of view, I don't have the answer. If we consider the situation today, we know that it was a trap, and that cooperation was a very, very bad thing. That, for example, and in France, certainly, the Germans were not so numerous, were not numerous enough to do the job alone. So they were totally unable to do the job alone. So from this point of view, Jews, for example, you have a huge debate about l'Union Générale des Israélites de France, the general union of the French Jews, which has in fact tried to cooperate to alleviate the situation. And many are very severe towards this organization, saying that it has in fact been a malediction rather than a godsend. But we have not to see the situation from now, but we have also to see the situation from the period from before. And what was very important was time. You know, you have a very huge controversy about the Jewish responsible of Loch, but you can put a lot of if in history. If the Russians had been able to come sooner to free Loch, to free Loch before, his gamble could have been successful, but the Russians did not. About the church, I think that you have what is very interesting in the French situation is that, first of all, the church never mobilized as a whole. I mean that these four prelates, who have been very, very courageous, were alone. They were not so numerous. In fact, the mobilization of the church has been a grassroots mobilization at, you see, the level of a church, of a parish, of a convent, of a congregation, but not at the level of the church considered as a whole. But what is very interesting is that these four prelates have not been sanctioned. So you see, you had no prosecution against them. So that means also that it was possible without a very, very heavy cost, you see, to protest.
Qué interesante, qué interesante. Gracias. Otra vez voy a juntar dos preguntas, porque se refieren a dos personas. Hay una pregunta que dice, si considera que el filósofo cristiano Jacques Maritain, parte de la resistencia en el extranjero, que luego emigró a los Estados Unidos junto con su esposa, si fue crítico del régimen de Vichy. Y la otra pregunta es, ¿qué papel cree que jugó el nazi Jacques de Maillet en el régimen de Vichy? Y después dice en la Argentina. Esta pregunta no sé quién es y no sé qué papel jugó en la Argentina, así que me interesa mucho su respuesta también.
Very interested in the answer.
So, according to Jacques de Maillet, I don't know, so I cannot answer. I think that Maritain has been very involved against the Vichy regime, and that he protested against the Vichy regime. So I am not a specialist of Maritain, but I think that it is what I have read about him.
O sea que nos quedamos sin saber quién era este Jacques de Maillet. Vamos a averiguar quién era, de qué se trataba. Ok, me parece que estamos en tiempo y no quiero abusar de la gente. Fue realmente interesantísimo. Y quiero hacer un comentario final. Así como se demostró en la Shoah que las sociedades humanas son capaces de la máxima crueldad dadas ciertas condiciones, también podemos ver cómo, a pesar del grado de complejidad de los elementos intervinientes, entre la maleza a veces cerrada de la indiferencia, la complicidad y la comodidad, se pueden asomar destellos de solidaridad, compromiso e involucración en el destino de nuestros semejantes. El antisemitismo está hondamente enraizado en la sociedad occidental heredera de la Iglesia. Seguimos haciendo esfuerzos por diluirlo, por amansarlo, esfuerzos que todavía no dan los frutos esperados. Estas investigaciones sobre la resistencia, donde se ven los contextos y las complejidades políticas, sociales y también individuales, nos muestran esa otra cara, eso que sigue siendo una asignatura pendiente, porque debe ser incluido en los programas formativos y educativos de nuestros jóvenes. Gracias, Olivier, por esta rica e interesante conferencia, y espero que nos veamos en Buenos Aires alguna vez cuando esta pandemia termine y podamos volver a viajar.
Able to travel again at some point.
So do I. Thank you.
Sí.
Muchísimas gracias nuevamente, doctor Olivier Biorca, querida Diana Wang, por esta maravillosa exposición y moderación respectivamente de lo que fue esta complejidad de Francia durante el Holocausto, las distintas conductas. Hubo una maravillosa diversificación que el doctor Biorca hizo acerca de los escenarios, las conductas de los distintos actores, y realmente nos ha despertado muchas intrigas, mucho más para investigar, y sobre todo desde aquí de la Argentina le agradecemos mucho por dejarnos abiertas estas preguntas que seguramente despertarán nuevas inquietudes para quienes nos acompañan. Gracias a todos los y las participantes de esta jornada de hoy.